On our march over the Berkshire Mountains, they would have given a louder huzzah, I guarantee you. So thank you, ladies, for that delicious meal. My name is Henry Knox. In a church of this theological persuasion, I might assume that some of you would be interested if I was connected with the famous reformer of Scotland, John Knox. And to satisfy your curiosity, the answer is indeed yes, I am. John Knox was not a direct descendant. He had daughters. But I am a direct descendant of John Knox's older brother, William Knox. So John Knox was my great uncle. William Knox was a nobleman who, in the days of the Reformation, stood strong for the defense of the faith and had the privilege of defending with the sword those truths of the Reformed faith that his brother, my uncle, great uncle, John Knox, defended with the pen and in the pulpit. I was born in Boston. For many years, Boston has been my only home. My parents were immigrants from the Ulster plantations in North Ireland, where many of my Scottish ancestors were forced by persecution to flee. And thus it was in Boston that my parents sought to make their fortune in the New World. The hope was that here they could have a new start, a new life, and a new legacy to build upon. However, these events failed for my family, and in the mysterious providence of God, a fortune was not to be. My father hoped to build a shipbuilding company, and that in the making of ships, we might find the wealth and success for which we longed. But alas, fame and fortune departed. And often you will find in your own lives that God takes away some things in order to give us others. When I was a boy, only 9 years old, some of you lads in the back may be about 9. Any of you 9 years old or thereabouts? 10, 11? What is it? How old are you? 10. When I was a lad a bit younger than he, we received the news that my father was dead. He had been forced by debts to go to the Caribbean, there to try to make his fortune again. And rather than good news, we received the news that our father was dead. And thus, at the age of 9, about the age of the lads in the back, I became the breadwinner for my mother. I was forced to leave my school, my learning, my books, and I became a courier for a bookshop, delivering books from the bookstore to those who desire to purchase them. Some of the esteemed gentlemen in Boston were great readers of history, of science, of language, and you may recognize some names. When I was but a boy, I delivered books to John Hancock, John Adams, a silversmith named Paul Revere. And my job as a lad was to take the book, run it to them, and deliver the book that they had ordered from the shop. In the employ of my master, whose name was Nicholas Bowes, I found a true friend. Young people, I hope that you appreciate the elders that God has placed in your life that encourage you to read, to learn. Nicholas Bowes was such a man for me. He not only employed me, but he gave me the liberty to peruse his shop. He told me as a lad that I could read any of his books that I chose, that I could learn whatever instruction they might contain. And thus, as a boy, I taught myself French. I learned also military science, the wars of antiquity. I read the wars of Julius Caesar. I read about a general called Hannibal, who with his elephants brought an army over the mountains of the Alps. Boys and girls, pay attention to what you read. Little did I know at the time that the wars of Hannibal would have any application to the life of a boy in Boston. But such became my destiny. I read history and military science. I took a special interest in the artillery. And as a boy, as a teenager, as I grew to manhood, I enjoyed hunting. On one occasion, perhaps you have noticed my left hand. On one occasion, a gun went off prematurely. A friend of mine was going with me out fowling to take waterfowl, and the shot went off into my hand. Firearms, and as I later came to see, cannon, are very dangerous things when used improperly. 2 of my fingers were severed, and another one was severed entirely at the time. Another one was hurt so severely it had to be amputated. The other tendons were so mangled that my left hand is of no use. But God had given me one good hand, and with that hand I would do what I could. As I came into my 18th year, I joined a militia company in Boston. There were several such companies. By this time, there was trouble between the English colonies and the good King George in England. First, it was the Stamp Act, whereby England sought to recoup her expenses of the French and Indian War. We called it the 7 Years' War. We recouped those expenses by taxing her colonies. The art of bookselling became a dangerous and difficult operation, for every piece of literature printed, every piece of mail delivered, every land deed transaction must have a British stamp. And the Boston leaders of the group that became the Sons of Liberty saw this as oppression. It is not that we wanted representation in Parliament, but rather that we should be taxed as our own local House of Representatives, for we had one in the colony of Massachusetts, that rather being taxed by His Majesty's government in England, we would be taxed properly and lawfully by the local parliament. This was our hope, and thus we sought redress. These troubles grew when the Stamp Act was finally rescinded. The king came out with his Townshend Acts. Many in Boston referred to these as the Intolerable Acts. The Tea Act was one. The Boston Port Act closed our ports from all foreign shipping. The Quartering Act, ladies and gentlemen, to have foreign troops. Well, they were not foreign troops, they were English troops, but they were from the dregs of society. Some were not even from England. And they were imposed on our houses, quartered in our homes. A group began to meet called the Sons of Liberty. I became a courier, one who delivered messages for the Sons of Liberty. We would hear the goings on and take them to men who knew what to do with the information, men such as Paul Revere, the silversmith, John Adams. At this time, I became a member of the local artillery company. I could not shoot a rifle with a hand like this. It requires two hands to load effectively, but I could fire a cannon. And thus I became acquainted with the artillery. In 1770, I was an eyewitness to the event that you may know as the Boston Massacre. It was not a massacre. I saw it with mine own eyes. British troops, sentries, were arrayed on the sidewalk, guarding the street. And though we opposed their presence, they were doing their duty. But tensions had risen to the point that peace could not be sustained. A snowball was thrown at one of the troops. Other troops were called to reinforce the guard. Finally, the drum was beat and the troops were brought out. A mob was gathering. I tried to calm the situation. I spoke to the officer in charge and told him that it was best for Boston that he go back to his barracks. Someone threw, after the snowball, a chunk of ice and then a rock. And then in the confusion, the guns were lowered and a flash was struck. As the apostle says in his epistle, "Behold how great a matter a little fire kindleth. And it matters not the source of the spark. When there is a kindling and a conflagration, there will be trouble. And thus it was with a word, a flash in the night, a spark in the pan. The powder was lit, and it could not be taken back again." By the time the night was over, 3 Bostonians were dead. John Adams, though he was an ardent patriot, defended the soldiers. At the trial, I, Henry Knox, was an eyewitness, and I testified in the trial. John Adams said, "Facts are stubborn things." And though it was an unfortunate incident, it was not a massacre, and the soldiers were acquitted of murder. However, blood had been shed, and soon the clouds of war were gathering. At this time, I was engaged in more peaceful conquests, namely, a young lady that sits here with me today. Lucy Flucker was her name, and that was my conquest and my pursuit. I had by this time opened up my own bookshop. I was the master. I had put my shingle on the door, the bookshop of Henry Knox. At 20 years old, I was hoping for a life of peace, that the troubles with the mother country would soon pass. Into my bookshop one day walked Miss Lucy and perused my volumes. And she returned. And it soon became rumored in the bookshop and also in the town, for ladies and gentlemen, matters like this spread quickly, that Lucy Flucker was either very interested suddenly in books, or she was interested in the bookseller. Conversation ensued, and a conquest was successfully made. In this case, it was very difficult, for her father was a loyalist. In fact, her whole family were loyalists. Lucy has a brother in the service of His Majesty in the army of Great Britain. Her father, knowing that I was interested in military science and that I had an interest in the artillery arm, actually offered me a commission in His Majesty's service. I could be, ladies and gentlemen, wearing the uniform of scarlet with more gold on my shoulders than I am wearing now. But there are some things more important that money cannot buy, and liberty is one of them. I had been convinced that the destiny of America was independence. And to that cause, I was willing, if necessary, to give my very life. Lucy became convinced that I was right. Astonishingly, her father gave his blessing, knowing that her mind would not be changed, and Lucy gave her hand to me in marriage. Shortly thereafter, April the 18th, 1775, soon after we were married, you know the date. On that night, lanterns were hung in the old steeple of the North Church, one if by land and two if by sea. My friend Paul Revere galloped into the countryside to spread the word that the British regulars were marching for American power, and I knew that my bookshop was doomed. It was with great sadness that night that we packed up our few belongings. I had by this time acquired a sword, and Lucy, with her needlework, a newlywed bride, now expecting we had just found out our first child, she took my sword and sewed it into her cape, lest we be searched by the British Guard. We were able to cross the river. They searched me for weapons, but they did not find the sword because Lucy was carrying it in her cape. We made it to the other side of the river, and by this time, trouble had come to the field at Lexington. The shot had been fired from which there was no retreat. Then again at Concord Bridge, and then on the way back to Boston, where farmers clad in ordinary farmers' clothes had fired upon the king's troops. Soon the drum roll was beat. More soldiers were added to Boston. I heard through the city that my bookshop had been ransacked, all of our belongings taken, the windows broken, and there was no turning back. I offered my sword to the cause of American liberty and reported to the general then in charge, General Gates. And it was under his command that I first served with the American artillery. I asked him, "Sir, where is the artillery park?" And he said, I had no rank at the time. He said, "Henry, there is none." In the American service, we had 2 cannon. With these cannon, we did some work at the Battle of Bunker Hill. But as that summer waxed on, there was a necessity. We knew that if we were to do any damage to the British, we must have cannon. It's not that cannon were not available. For in June, Ethan Allen and a general that you should know, Benedict Arnold, a very brave and successful commander, had seized British cannon up at Fort Ticonderoga. But Fort Ticonderoga is 300 miles from Boston. When General Washington took command of the army in August, he surveyed my little battery at Roxbury. And he found out through conversation that I knew something of the handling of cannon. And I was asked if I would be willing in the coming winter to go to Fort Ticonderoga and to bring by secret route cannon to Boston. If I had known then, ladies and gentlemen, the troubles, I probably would have thought it impossible. But I took the task, went to Fort Ticonderoga in September. I found the cannon. Out of the 100 cannon that were there, I found only a few 59 mortars, artillery that were even serviceable. Many of the cannon were rusted out through misuse. The carriages were unable to be hauled. But I took these cannon that were available, turned them upside down so that the touch holes would not take on water, and prepared them for embarkation. We had to sail down Lake George. We put them all in a big barge. We had no sooner set out, friends, that the barge containing all of our cannon sunk in the waters of Lake George. What was to be done? In the providence of God, they had sunk in but 7 feet of water. And with the help of the sturdy seamen, we fixed the leak. We're able to bail out the boat. And oh, what a joy it was to the soul of this bookseller to see our barge floating again. We continued down Lake George in good weather, fair weather. But how to get the cannon to Boston? No wagon in New England could take them. One of the pieces, a 24-pounder, weighed 5,000 pounds. Fired a 24-pound projectile. It was 11 feet long. There was no wagon in America that could haul such a piece. What then might haul them? What would you have done, my friends? Exceedingly strong sleds. And so I ordered 42 sleds, 80 yoke of oxen built and procured, hired 2 teamsters, a father and son, John Becker and his son, John Becker, to take them. We mounted the cannon on these sleds, but in order to pull sleds, what do you need? Snow. And snow, friends, we had none. We enjoyed the fair weather on Lake George, and so we waited into the Indian summer. It was now November. Late November, December had come. We had finally reached the place on the southern tip of Lake George we needed to be, and still there was no snow. We waited for snow. We prayed for snow. We longed for snow, and we looked for snow. And finally, on December the 24th, I received the Christmas present for which I was waiting. I had been dreaming of a white Christmas. Someone perhaps should write a song of that title someday. I got my snow, 2 feet of it, ladies and gentlemen. And on that snow, we proceeded on our way. We came to the Hudson River. After many days of march, to cross the Hudson, we must. I weigh 250 pounds, and it is no light thing, believe me, to step out upon the ice, let alone to bring a 5,000-pound cannon. We decided to go with a big one first. If it made it, they all would make it. And as we slid that 11-foot cannon across the ice at the Hudson near the town of Albany, we heard an ominous crack. And after the crack, that gun upon which the fate of Boston depended slid through the ice into the icy waters. Have you ever been tempted to quit? These were events that made me want to say, oh, General Washington perhaps can do without this one. But it would not be to leave a cannon behind. Thankfully, one of my teamsters had attached a buoy to the cannon for just such an emergency. And down this rope, one of my brave men went into the dark, icy water to attach heavy chains around the cannon. We slid it somehow, after many hours of labor, out of the icy water, onto the ice, minus its sled, slid it along, and found a stronger place in the river, where after another day and a half, all of our artillery safely crossed. This was not the only crossing. This was the first of 4 that we must cross the Hudson. We lost one other cannon and likewise retrieved it. After this, we must cross the Berkshire Mountains. Steep slopes, dangerous cliffs, yawning ravines. We lost oxen, we lost horses, but by the grace of God, we did not lose even one cannon, nor did we lose a man. It was one thing to take the cannon up by means of pulleys, but what do you do, ladies and gentlemen, with a 5,000-pound cannon at the top of a mountain on a sled? How do you get it safely down? These were problems that my teamster solved. By the grace of God, after many days of hard sledding, I was able to ride my horse into Cambridge, there to find the headquarters of General Washington. He had not heard from me except from when I was at Lake George, and he was very anxious about my progress. I approached him, I gave him my salute, and I said, "Sir, I hope soon to present to your excellency an exceedingly good train of noble artillery." It took several days for the cannon to roll into Cambridge. Many of the good people had never seen a gun like this before. They came out in droves to witness the simple sight of a cannon that would stretch across all of these pews. A cannon they knew would soon thunder against the fleet in Boston. They came out with geese, with partridges, and we were as refreshed by their goods as they were by the news that we were coming. And we partook of their cider to our great delight. General Washington sealed a tight cord around Boston that not a message could get across to the British. The British General Sir William Howe, in his cozy quarters, could not dream in all the world that an American force was on the move in the dead of winter. British armies did not move in the winter time, and thus the secret, by the providence of God, was kept. Rumors came to Lord Howe that the Americans had brought cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, but General Howe thought the idea itself preposterous. How could the Americans bring cannon from Ticonderoga in weather like this? And thus, he pulled up his heavy quilt and went back to sleep. On March the 4th, we decided this would be the night. March the 4th, 1776. We had prepared everything. Chandeliers for protection. A chandelier is not one of these, ladies and gentlemen, but a piece of lattice work into which rocks and dirt can be placed. A temporary fortification. They were rolled to the top of the hill. 10,000 men, American troops, labored in one night to mount 39 pieces of heavy artillery atop an unfortified ridge overlooking Boston known as Dorchester Heights. It had been selected as a place from which our cannon could not be dislodged. And thus it was on the morning of March the 4th that Sir William Howe was summoned from his chambers and took his spyglass out to look at the cannon in our position. He said to his men, "Good God, these rebels have done more in one night than my entire army could do in 4 months." And he knew in that moment that he was outgunned. It was with great satisfaction that with this right hand, I first struck the gun that opened the deliverance of my town, Boston. The cannon roared. The British tried to answer, but they could not elevate their naval guns to dislodge our position. They planned an armed assault by British Marines, but General Washington was ready for them. And what was more than that, the Lord Almighty thundered against them. A storm of wind and hail and sleet and rain drove the British Marines back. Thus it was that the British fleet loosed their topsails on that memorable day and sailed out of Boston Harbor, leaving Boston free. My good friend, in Boston, William Billings composed a hymn testifying of God's mercy to New England. I sang bass in his choir, and I still sing with the gentlemen when I have opportunity. The hymn opens this way. Let tyrants shake their iron rod, and slavery clang her galling chains. We fear them not, we trust in God, New England's God forever reigns. Amen. The song ends this way, and I will end here with this story of God's deliverance. There are more battles, ladies and gentlemen, to fight. I have just received intelligence that the British Navy is headed down for New York City. My cannon are already on the move. I must join them there. There are more battles to be fought. By the grace of God, more victories to be won. I would like to sing the final hymn and then lead you in a rousing huzzah for His Excellency General Washington and the American Continental Army. What grateful offering shall we bring? What shall we render to the Lord? Loud hallelujahs let us sing, and praise His name on every chord. Ladies and gentlemen, here to General Washington, to the Continental Congress, hip hip huzzah, hip hip huzzah, hip hip huzzah. To my post, ladies and gentlemen, I must now repair. May God be with you all, and may God grant us victory in the day of battle.